They told the old black man he didn't belong. They blocked him at the gate of a four-star general's funeral. Said he wasn't on the list. But when the highest-ranking officer there saw who he was, he stopped everything because that man didn't. Just know the general. He made him who he was. They blocked the old black man. Then a four-star general stopped the funeral for him. It was the kind of ceremony that makes the world pause. A full military funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, where legends are laid to rest. Rows of uniformed soldiers stood like statues, chests out, boots shined to mirror perfection. The air was heavy, still, reverent. American flags lined the path, their stars and stripes rippling in a soft wind that seemed to carry the weight of history itself. At the far end, a flag-draped casket waited, guarded by honor. A 21-gun salute was prepped and ready, each rifle polished, each soldier rehearsed down to the second. This was no ordinary funeral. The man being buried was a four-star general, decorated, respected, one of the few to ever rise that high. His death had summoned top military brass, foreign dignitaries, family, friends, and reporters. It was to be a precise, picture-perfect farewell, but just as the band tuned their final note and the first officer prepared to speak, a small ripple moved through the crowd at the gate. An old black man, dressed in a suit that had clearly seen better days, was approaching. His coat hung a little too loose. His shoes were scuffed at the toes. One button on his jacket was barely hanging on. In one hand, he carried a cane. Not fancy, just worn smooth by time and use. His steps were slow but deliberate, like someone who'd fought through pain before and wasn't afraid to do it again. He didn't look like the others. He wasn't escorted. No medals on his chest, no crisp military uniform, just silence, presence, and a sense of something deeper behind his eyes. He walked toward the gate with the kind of calm that only comes from age and experience. He wasn't in a hurry, but he wasn't unsure either. It was clear he belonged to this moment in some way. But the guards standing watch didn't see it that way. Two young soldiers stepped forward. One held up a hand. "Sir," he said politely but firmly, "this is a private service. Only military personnel and family are allowed beyond this point." The old man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or demand respect. Instead, he reached into his jacket and slowly pulled out an old photograph, creased and yellowed with time. In it, a younger version of himself stood beside a young soldier, grinning with pride. The soldier in the picture was unmistakably the man now lying in the flag-draped casket. "I knew him," the old man said quietly. "He called me his second father." The guards looked at each other, uncertain. Their orders were clear, and the list they'd been given didn't include him. One shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. You're not on the list. I can't let you through." The old man gave a nod. No anger, no protest, just quiet acceptance. He turned around, walked a few steps back, and sat down on a nearby bench, alone. While inside, a hero's funeral began. Without the man who helped shape the hero. "Sir, this is a military-only service," the young officer said, stepping forward with a measured firmness in his voice. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful, just doing what he had been trained to do. Behind him, two more officers moved closer, forming a subtle barrier between the old man and the path to the ceremony. The old man paused. He didn't flinch, didn't argue. He looked at them calmly, as if he had expected this, as if this wasn't the first time someone had stood between him and something he had every right to be part of. Another voice chimed in, a bit more direct. This time, family and ranking officials only. A few heads turned from the crowd behind the rope lines, curious. Some squinted, trying to figure out why an elderly man in a worn suit was causing a delay. But nobody stepped forward to help. The rules were the rules. The old man slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a brown leather wallet. Old, the corners cracked and curling. From it, he carefully removed a small, weathered photograph. The creases were deep, the edges frayed. He held it up with trembling fingers, not to demand anything, just to explain. The young officer leaned in and took a look. In the photo stood a much younger version of the old man, his back straighter, face fuller. But those eyes were unmistakable, and next to him, in crisp army green, was a young soldier grinning ear to ear. The same man who now rested inside the flag-draped casket, just steps away. Their arms were around each other like father and son. "I knew him," the old man said, quietly, his voice steady but tired. "He wasn't just a soldier to me. He was like my own. I mentored him when he was just starting out, back when no one thought he'd ever be more than a foot soldier." He paused and looked beyond the guards, toward the burial site. "He used to call me his second father." The young officer hesitated. He looked at the photo again, then at the man. His training told him to stand firm, but something else, something human, made him want to listen. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then glanced toward a superior officer behind him, unsure. But protocol won. "I'm really sorry, sir," the officer finally said. "I believe you. I do. But you're not on the list. If you wait here, maybe I can find someone who can help." But the old man was already stepping back, nodding slowly. He didn't need to be convinced. He'd been denied access to spaces like this before, long before the world noticed his worth. He walked over to a weathered bench just off to the side of the path, folded the photo gently back into his wallet, and sat down. Quiet. Alone. His presence overlooked, again, but someone was watching. And this wasn't the end of his story. The guards hesitated. For a moment, the rules clashed with reality. The young officer still held the photograph in his hand, staring at it, his brow furrowed. The man in the picture was unmistakably the general they were burying that day. And the man beside him? He wasn't just a stranger off the street. There was something in that old photo, something undeniable. A bond. The other guards glanced at each other, unsure. No one had trained them for this. Their list didn't have his name. Their orders didn't mention exceptions. Their job was to follow protocol no matter what. "Rules are rules," one whispered. The lead officer took a breath, then slowly handed the photo back. He looked the old man in the eye, not with disrespect, but with a kind of helplessness. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "We can't let you in." There was a long silence. The old man looked down at the photo for a second, then tucked it gently back into his wallet. He gave a quiet nod, no argument, no resistance. His face didn't twist in frustration. He didn't plead, didn't protest. If anything, he looked resigned. Like this wasn't the first time he'd been told he didn't belong somewhere important. Like he'd lived through decades of doors that stayed closed, despite everything he'd done behind them. And so, without a word, he stepped back. He turned away from the ceremonial pathway, his shoulders slightly slumped, but his dignity fully intact. Step by step, he walked toward a weathered stone bench near a tree. It was just outside the sightline of the main gathering, but close enough to hear the muffled speeches and distant hum of the bugle warming up. He sat down carefully, gripping his cane, then resting it gently beside him. And then he just watched. He watched as decorated generals in gleaming uniforms took their seats. He watched families clutch tissues and tightly folded programs. He watched as the honor guard took their position, every move rehearsed, every salute sharp. A folded American flag sat waiting on a velvet cushion, but he remained on the bench, unnoticed, uninvited, unwelcome, not by the man being buried, but by the system still standing guard over his memory. Around him, life carried on. The breeze rustled the trees. Leaves fluttered past his feet. A few birds called out in the distance, their songs blending with the soft murmurs of the crowd. And though his heart was heavy, he did not weep. Because he hadn't come to be seen. He'd come to say goodbye, whether they let him through the gate or not. And yet, what no one there realized, not the officers, not the family, not the soldiers with medals on their chests, was that this man had shaped the very soul of the general they were now honoring, and soon, someone would remember that. The wind shifted, just as the chaplain stepped up to the podium, just as the hush of solemn expectation blanketed the cemetery, a hand rose in the air. Not just any hand, but the firm, commanding hand of General Marcus Holloway, a towering figure in full-dress uniform, his chest lined with ribbons and stars that marked decades of service. He stood still, tall and resolute as his hand sliced silently through the air like a blade. The funeral stopped. Soldiers who were mid-step froze. The color guard paused mid-turn. The honor guard lowered their rifles ever so slightly. The chaplain, words caught in his throat, looked out over the sea of uniforms and civilians in confusion. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft at first, like a question rolling from one row to the next. Why had he stopped the ceremony? General Holloway didn't say a word at first. He scanned the crowd, then turned slowly, eyes locking on the front gate. His expression tightened. There, just beyond the marble pillars, sitting alone on a worn bench under the shadow of an old oak was the old man, still, silent, forgotten by all except the one person who recognized everything he represented. Holloway took a step toward the perimeter, then another. Everyone watched, stunned, unsure if this was part of the ceremony or a breach of it. When he reached the guards standing near the gate, his voice cut through the still air. "Why is he outside the gate?" he asked, his voice calm but cold and firm. He didn't point with anger, but with precision, like a general asking why a crucial part of the mission had been left behind. The guards straightened instantly. One of them, the same young officer who had turned the old man away, swallowed, hard. "Sir, he wasn't on the list. We were told only military personnel, family, and ranking officials." Holloway raised a hand to stop him. Not in anger, in authority. Then, quieter, more measured, he asked again, "That man right there, do you know who he is?" Silence. One of the guards glanced again at the old man, who now looked up, clearly surprised that all eyes had turned his way. Holloway took a breath, and this time his voice carried weight, not just of rank, but of memory. "That man is the reason your general ever became one." Gasps and whispers followed. A few soldiers furrowed their brows. Civilians leaned forward. The general stepped forward once more, his gaze fixed firmly on the bench. He didn't serve for glory. He didn't wear medals. But he carried young men like your general on his back, through failure, doubt, and fear. He deserves a front-row seat more than most of us here. And with that, General Holloway did what no one expected. He walked, past the gate, toward the bench, toward the man the world had just tried to forget, and reminded everyone watching what true honor looks like. "He's not on the list, sir," one of the guards said, his voice barely above a whisper. The young soldier stood stiff, his eyes darting between the general and the old man on the bench. He had followed protocol. He had done exactly what the binder in his hands told him to do. But now, under the piercing gaze of General Holloway, his confidence began to unravel. The general's jaw tightened. His eyes, once calm and observant, now burned with restrained fire. He took a step closer to the guard, his voice firm and measured. "That man," Holloway said, pointing again without hesitation, "taught our fallen brother how to lead." Silence swept across the rows of soldiers. All eyes were now on the bench beneath the oak tree. He taught him how to endure when everything broke down. He taught him how to rise after he failed. The general's words echoed off the white headstones, each one holding its own story, its own sacrifice. But none of them felt more alive in that moment than the one now unfolding. When others gave up on him, when no one saw what he could become, Holloway continued, that man marched beside him, not because he had to, but because he believed in him. Gasps were audible now. Civilians in the back exchanged hushed remarks. Some of the senior officers leaned in, suddenly remembering an old story they'd once heard, about a young soldier who credited his rise to a quiet, steadfast mentor from back home, a man who was never in the spotlight, but always in his corner. The general took a breath, then delivered the line that would stop time. He made that general who he was. It wasn't just a statement. It was truth. A truth everyone had forgotten. Until now, and in that moment, something shifted. The weight of rank, the polish of uniforms, the pageantry of protocol, it all fell away. What remained was honor. And General Holloway made it clear there was no list that could keep that man outside the gates of a funeral he had earned the right to attend. Without waiting for permission, General Holloway moved. No hesitation, no consultation. No radioed call for approval. just quiet, determined steps toward the old man on the bench. Each step echoed through the silence like a drumbeat of justice. The crowd parted as he passed. Officers stiffened, civilians froze. Even the guards at the gate lowered their eyes, realizing that something sacred was happening, something more important than the chain of command. The old man looked up as the general approached. For a moment he seemed unsure, almost ready to stand on his own, to excuse himself from the spotlight. But Holloway reached out gently, offering a steady hand. "Come with me," he said, and with that he helped him to his feet. It was a quiet gesture, but one louder than any salute. A four-star general, one of the highest-ranking men in the country, extending his hand not to a fellow officer, not to a dignitary, but to the man behind the legend, the one the world had nearly forgotten. They walked together, shoulder to shoulder, past the gates that had once shut him out, past the guards who now stood aside with shame in their eyes, past rows of medals and ribbons, past generals and colonels, politicians and press. And the moment they crossed into the front rows, something remarkable happened. The entire crowd rose to their feet, not out of protocol, not because they were ordered to, but because something inside them knew this was right. Every soldier, regardless of rank, snapped to salute. Uniforms crisp, arms raised in perfect form. But their salutes weren't for General Holloway. They were for the man beside him, the old man. Still wearing his weathered suit, holding his cane like a staff of quiet strength, looked out at the sea of faces now honoring him. And when he reached the front row, the general pulled out a chair, his own reserved seat, and motioned for the old man to sit. "This is your place," he said. "It always was." The old man sat slowly, taking in the moment, not with pride, but with deep, quiet gratitude. A seat earned not by medals, but by the life he had lived, and the man he had helped raise, and for the first time that day the ceremony truly began. The rest of the funeral continued. The chaplain returned to the podium, his voice steadier now, though touched with something deeper. Reverence not just for the man being laid to rest, but for the moment they had all just witnessed. Rows of soldiers stood with renewed posture, their chests lifted, eyes forward, as if somehow they had all grown prouder, not only of the general, but of the institution they represented. But make no mistake, something had shifted. This wasn't just a ceremony for a four-star general anymore. It had become something larger, something that couldn't be printed on a program or written in an obituary. As the sunlight filtered through the trees and the American flag was slowly drawn from the casket, people weren't just thinking about the general's medals or his tours of duty. They were thinking about who had made him who he was, the foundation, the shoulders he stood on, eyes turned again and again to the old man in the front row. He didn't move much. He didn't need to. His presence spoke louder than words. No speech could match the weight of what he had lived. And as the bugler stepped forward, trumpet raised, and the opening notes of taps rang out into the sky, many in the crowd felt something they hadn't expected when they arrived that morning. Not just grief, not just pride, but clarity. They saw perhaps for the first time what real leadership looked like, not just in uniform, not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet mentorship, the unseen sacrifice, the daily lifting up of another soul. The folding of the flag began, tight, precise movements carried out with utmost care. The stars facing out, a symbol of honor. The triangle passed from soldier to soldier until it reached General Holloway himself. He held it for a moment, his eyes resting not on the casket, but on the old man beside him. Then, with deep respect, he leaned forward and placed the folded flag in the old man's lap. "From him," Holloway whispered, "to you." The old man didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply placed a wrinkled hand on the flag, closed his eyes, and nodded, because he knew. He'd always known. As the crowd slowly began to leave, many took one last look back, not at the casket, but at the man beside it. The one who never wore stars on his shoulders, but had shaped one of the brightest among them. And that day, in a cemetery where thousands rest with honor, A message was written silently across every heart. Respect isn't earned by rank. It's earned by legacy, by who you lift, who you guide, and who you help become more than they believed they could be. And sometimes, the greatest soldiers are the ones we almost overlook.